Well, today I'm delighted that we have Daniel Thelesklaf, former director of the Swiss FIU, former co-chair of the Risk Trends and Methods Group of FATF, and now an AML consultant. So hopefully enjoying potentially in this interview some freedom to talk about that experience that you have amassed. Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Nick, and thank you for having me here.
So if we could kick things off, in this series, we're engaging with leaders and innovators in the field of public-private information sharing to detect crime. Could you talk us through the current situation in Switzerland with regard to public-private information sharing for AML purposes? Yeah,
with pleasure. Thanks a lot. I think first of all, when we started this journey to establish a private-public partnership in Switzerland, we recalled that Switzerland has a long tradition in collaboration between the private and the public sector in fighting crime. It was actually way back in the late 80s when the Swiss banks set up something like an agreement between the banks, which dealt with customer identification, beneficial ownership at that time already. And this agreement among the banks, which was supported also by the supervisor, has then been the fundamental of the first FATF standard. So I think there's a long-standing tradition in doing that. But it hasn't really moved from where it was in the late 80s. And I think one of the reasons was probably the many issues around tax compliance of Swiss banks in the last 10 years. There was the financial crisis to 2008, 2009 that have sort of reduced the trust in the private sector to be a credible partner to fight financial crime. And I think that's why it took us a while in Switzerland to re-establish, following the models we have seen in other countries, following the important work Ruzi is doing in that regard. And this is why the establishment of a private-public partnership has become a cornerstone of the strategy that we developed at the FIU about a year ago, and we have made first steps to establishing. So the concept is ready. It's now subject to agreement to all partners, which I don't know where it will embark from now on, but the partnership, as we have designed it, puts the FIU in quite a central role for many reasons, but always keeping the private sector representatives at equal footing. I think at eye level. From the very beginning, they were involved in how we set up the concept. And I think that's an important element. If you speak of a partnership, you have to treat people like partners.
And obviously the process from the FIU perspective won't benefit from your directorship, but obviously you've kicked things off. Where would you like to see it from an external perspective now? Where would you like to see information sharing get to in Switzerland over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, and I think such an initiative should never be dependent on one person. I think that would be a big mistake. So that's hopefully not the case in Switzerland. It's difficult to make a forecast, but certainly what I would like to see is that later in this year, early next year, the partnership will be officially launched, and we were thinking of 3 work streams, and we would hope that then next year the 3 work streams would actually start to do the work. One work stream is related to operational matters. Now, I don't think you can speak of a partnership if you don't include operational work to be done. I think a series of meetings to talk about regulatory or supervisory issues is good, but it's not a partnership. So one work stream predominantly deals with sharing information. There are massive limitations in the current Swiss legal system to sharing information, both private-public as well as private-private, sometimes even public-public. There's a long tradition of putting privacy at a very high level and giving it a very high status. And despite banking secrecy, it doesn't have the same, let me say, elements as it used to be. It's still there, and it still is an obstacle and a barrier to information sharing. Also in Switzerland, police does not have a strong role in financial investigations as, for example, in the UK. The lead is clearly with the prosecutors. Probably prosecutors are a little bit more concerned about collaborating with the private sector, so basically the same institution they run investigations against, than others would have. So we'll see where it will end up. Somebody must take the lead now. I think the FIU was perfectly positioned given the circumstances, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the FIUs. And I think the work you're doing at RUSI shows that each country has to find its own way how to set up the partnership. Led by FIU is only one model, and in Switzerland, maybe a stronger role now for the regulator to come up, which is the Ministry of Finance. Supervisors' roles in partnerships is also something that is developing. We see different models around the world. In Switzerland, I think the supervisor is in a position to contribute to a partnership. Probably will not have the central role in it, given many reasons. Certainly, what makes me optimistic that the partnership will fly one day is the interest of the private sector, and this has changed fundamentally over the last 20 years. When I speak of the private sector, I probably have to speak of the large international banks. Probably not so much the smaller boutique private wealth management banks, which probably need to take a few more steps before they are where the large banks already are. The perfect partner in a partnership is one that is an experienced partner, and certainly with some of the large Swiss banks participating in partnerships in other countries has helped us a lot to come quickly to a common understanding. So frankly, there is interest on both sides, but somebody has to be pushing these efforts now. And I hope that the large international banks will be pushing also for the establishment of a partnership in Switzerland.
And can you talk us through the process that you've been involved in over recent months in terms of building the foundation for a partnership, perhaps some lessons that you've drawn from that process?
I think the first step was really to raise awareness, address concerns that are around. Also have a phased approach was important to us, and not to start with immediately information sharing and pushing all boundaries, but to go step by step and do what is possible at the moment, and then raise common interest to actually then push boundaries and even come up with joint proposals for amendments to the legislation. Also importantly for us to develop the partnership was what I mentioned is to be at equal footing. So we involved the private sector from the very outset in the whole concept. Of course, that we needed some time to agree among authorities on what a possible approach could be. But from then on, the private sector was fully involved and saw the concept notes. The pandemic crisis didn't make it easier, so we had to do it offline, basically through written comments. And suddenly we have come to the point where we believe now we have to sit together. I know the virtual world is fine, but it doesn't replace anything. So the concept is solid. 90% is basically made of these three work streams: operational, legal matters, and IT. And the IT element has come actually also from the private sector. We haven't thought of it immediately in the beginning, but I think at the end of the day, also with the view to address privacy concerns, IT is going to be fundamental. And you have to look at it from the very beginning of a partnership of how you bring in IT. On that, what I mean is technology in a wider sense than only IT. Also, in the development, we have from the outset started to look at the resource implications. There may be a challenge for partnerships if you are not serious about the resource implication. It does take resources. It will pay off at the end, but initially you have to invest human resources, a bit of money, and all partners have to agree on that before you can actually make them the big plans.
And zooming out a little from Switzerland, benefiting from your work at FATF on the risk trends and methods group, where do you see the next 5 years or more in terms of the reforms to the effectiveness of how we tackle financial crime? Do you think, broadly we're on the right track, or do you think there needs to be a significant change in thinking and approach?
Well, I think broadly the criminals are still on the right track. And if you look at the figures, it's disappointing. We cannot be satisfied by the results we have achieved so far. Yes, the figures, they go to the right direction. We see an increase in number of investigations, confiscations, convictions, but it's still, we're lacking far behind of what is necessary. Let's have an honest conversation about that. And I think we have moved towards a more honest conversation, both in the private sector as well as, for example, in FATF, people don't turn a blind eye on the deficiencies we have in terms of effectiveness. I think one fundamental change we need is to come from something rather reactive to something proactive. Let me make an example. A lot of people now put resources into cases that have occurred in the past, like Danske Bank, just to bring an example here. There are many other banks who have failed to perform well in that regard, but Danske is a prominent case, which is in the public domain. So we're looking at transactions that occurred a few years ago, and not a lot will result from that. I'm very pessimistic that we will see a lot of investigations or confiscations from that, but we put a lot of resources in it. Wouldn't it be far more interesting to actually learn how these criminals launder money today? Are they still going through the same countries? Are they still using banks? What is the role of cryptocurrencies? How has the pattern changed after we have discovered a scheme or a laundromat or whatever you called it? Because most likely it's not what we're looking at now, what they're doing now. So coming from reactive to proactive is probably that we have to move into. And in that context, we have to far better understand how criminals work. If you look at the success stories in fighting organized crime in countries like Italy and the US, for example, financial intelligence alone will not resolve the problem. You do need, technically, you need human intelligence too. So I think from an investigatory perspective, we have to much better understand how these organizations work that launder money on a high scale. That would include bringing people into these organizations, turning people around, if you know what I mean. So have crown witnesses, and then share that information from the public to the private sector. If you can't think how a money launderer thinks, you will never be a good anti-money laundering expert. Certainly, we do need to tackle the issue of the conflict of interest between privacy and fighting money laundering and terrorist financing. It's on the table, and I think Rusi is doing great work also with the report you've just published on providing solutions. So to stop the endless debate of what is more important, well, both is important. A right to privacy is important, and the right to live in a safe environment that is free of criminality is important too. So let's work towards solutions, how we can combine the two. And congrats on really the work you're doing there. We also need to much better understand the role of each other and how we work. And again, the public-private partnerships, we do only measure confiscations and convictions. I think the raising mutual understanding of each other's jobs is also a huge benefit that is probably a little bit harder to measure, but we shouldn't underestimate that. And finally, I've done quite a lot of work in the South, so in development work. I think we have to be very careful that we don't reach a relatively high level here in the developed countries and leave the others behind. We have seen in the Corona crisis that we can work wherever. Authorities have completely shifted their work to work remotely. Criminals have done the same probably a long time before. So nothing would stop them to start using countries and jurisdictions that are far less regulated and move the dirty business there. So we need to help our colleagues, both in the public as well as in the private sector, in the lesser developed countries. If not, we're going to be pretty successful here, but then the whole laundering will take place somewhere else and will come through the back door back to our countries or to the financial institutions here.
Daniel, thank you so much. I think we could talk for hours, but we look forward to having in-person events and conferences where we can really engage with some of the big meaty ideas that you have put forward over these last few minutes, when the environment permits. Thank you so much, Daniel, for speaking to us today and sharing those insights. Really fantastic to hear from you, and look forward to staying in touch in the future.
So do I. Thanks for having me and have a good day.
Thank you, Daniel.